Nazis for resisting.
Well, maybe that brings us to a perhaps awkward segue, thinking about comparisons and making comparisons, into welcoming everybody and getting us started with the more formal part of this event, though I have to say the past 5 minutes or so have been really interesting. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Jenny Rich. I'm the executive director of the Rowan Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights. And I'm really happy that you all are here today, and especially happy that Susan Neiman is here to join us. I'll pass it over to our program director, Jody Russell Manning, in a moment, but just wanted to sort of officially welcome everybody, thank our co-sponsors, the Holly Bush Institute for Global Peace and Security and International Studies, and note that we are very grateful that this event has been made possible by an undergraduate international studies and foreign language grant from the United States Department of Education that we can use, that Rowan can use to help grow our international studies, language offerings, related programs like this one. So one logistical note, if possible, actually not if possible, let me just tell you the only place that we're going to be checking during this conversation is the question and answer space as opposed to the chat, just to make our lives easier as we facilitate questions. We don't want to overlook anything. So the question and answer box is those 3 small dots that you would have on the bottom right hand of your screen that say panel options. If you click on that, Q&A will pop up. That will then open a question and answer space. Professor Manning and I will be monitoring that throughout. We'll share questions a little bit later on. I'll put a little reminder note in the chat box now that will be as polite as possible, also asking you to not leave us notes there, but go somewhere else to do it. That being said, thank you all again, and I will pass this over to Professor Manning.
Hello, welcome. So I am, if you don't know me, I am Professor Jody Russell Manning. I am the program director for the Rowan Center for the Study of Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights. And a real quick, since I am the program director for the center, I want to quickly also mention one more event coming up on Wednesday, the 9th of December at 5 p.m. Please join us as Critical Junctures, an international studies lecture series, presents Anti-Semitism and the Return of Fascism, an invited talk by Dr. Richard Steigman Gall of Kent State University. So that again will be on December 9th at 5 p.m. If you would like the link, please email me or the center. And please, I'm going to introduce Professor Neiman here, who, as she has said, lives in Berlin, a wonderful city we could talk forever about, right, being there. She is the director of the Distinguished Einstein Forum and born in Atlanta, Georgia, a rather pivotal state at the current time. Susan, maybe you can comment as well on that coming up. But she studied philosophy at Harvard and at the prestigious Free University of Berlin. She was a professor of philosophy at Yale and Tel Aviv University. She is a moral philosopher, cultural commentator, and essayist. She has written extensively on the juncture between Enlightenment moral philosophy, metaphysics, and politics, both for scholarly audiences and the general public. She's author of numerous publications, just to mention, including Evil in Modern Thought. We have many debates about evil here and what that means, actually. And also another book called Why Grow Up? I agree, right? We are extremely honored to have Professor Neiman as our guest speaker, since her recent work on learning from the Germans, race, and the memory of evil has been the focus of this semester's Center Book Club. Thank you for your willingness to speak to the Rowan community and this rich and engaging work. Clearly, this is a very timely discussion. Memory, politics, and memorialization, of course, are extremely fluid and ever-changing. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Neiman. Thank you very much. So maybe to talk a little bit about your work and go into questions. So welcome.
Thanks very much, Jody, and thank you for the invitation. I think the best thing for me to do is to start by talking about why I wrote this book. And it will, then I think some of the main themes will become clear, and then I'd just love to have questions on any aspect of it or any aspect of what I say. Obviously, I'm delighted that you've been reading it in a book club. That's you're not alone. It's very nice to know that people are, across the country really thinking about these questions. So this book sort of has two beginnings, and one of them is in 1982, when I first came to Berlin as a Fulbright Fellow, working on a dissertation on Immanuel Kant's theory of reason, and thinking I was going to stay a year and go back to the academic track. And what stopped me was my fascination with what the Germans call Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. Germans like long compound words. That one I translate as working off the past or working through the past. I had gone, this was a time when very few Americans, if they weren't connected to the army, and even fewer Jews set foot in Berlin. Of course, now it's very trendy, but it wasn't at the time. Berlin was still surrounded by a wall, and perhaps more importantly, I think, surrounded by an aura of Third Reich about which Americans knew very little, but it still functioned, as it does today, unfortunately, as a symbol of absolute evil, even without knowing very much about it. People tend to think the end of the Holocaust, people loaded into cattle cars and being murdered mechanically. They don't tend to think much about the beginning, and they certainly don't know what happened afterwards. And I know that when I went, it was rather controversial. And I said, look, 40 years after the war, isn't it just as racist and prejudiced to refuse to set foot in Germany as anything that the Germans did 40 years ago? It's over, I thought. And I, I came to know much better, because in 1982, the sort of people that I would naturally gravitate towards, that is by no means the whole of the country or even the city, but intellectuals, artists, activists, were all preparing to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Hitler's takeover of power. In view of current events, I should emphasize that the Nazis like to call it the power takeover, as if it was something that was done with violence. Actually, it wasn't. It was a legal election. Once they were legally elected to power, they went on to destroy every other political party and every other political institution, but it was a perfectly legal election in January 1933. So my new acquaintances were completely caught up in this process of Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, and what that meant was manifold, and that's one of the first things that I think is important for Americans to learn. It's not a one-shot deal. It involves looking at history in all kinds of ways. At the time, there were people who were researching the history of their neighborhoods, trying to figure out what the Nazis actually did, neighborhood by neighborhood, and making exhibits, making historical exhibits. People were making films. People were putting on plays. There was a huge exhibit put on of all of the synagogues that were destroyed in Kristallnacht. And it was, you couldn't go anywhere without being confronted with it, although at that point, this was not a government-sponsored process. It was very much grassroots. And I remember saying, just in my very first few months in Berlin, why don't we have anything like this in America? And what I was thinking about was not our, long past history, but the fact that as soon as the Vietnam War was over, people stopped talking about the war in Vietnam. We have not had a discussion about the war in Vietnam to this day. We never had a discussion about Hiroshima. And in fact, when on the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, the Smithsonian Museum tried to do an exhibit around the plane, the Enola Gay, which dropped the bomb, Congress actually prevented them from holding an exhibit that even discussed the question, was it necessary to drop the bomb, and what were the consequences for the Japanese? That was just simply ruled out in 1995. So all of these were discussions that we hadn't had, and I became increasingly fascinated with the ways in which the Germans were engaging with their history. Now, I left Berlin in 1988, largely because I felt it was not a place, I'd had my first child by then, it was not a place where I wanted to raise a Jewish or even a foreign child. It still felt very fragile to me. There was still quite a bit of uncomfortableness with foreigners and Jews. But 12 years later, when I was offered a job at the Einstein Forum, which is an international public think tank, the country had gone through a serious political change. And part of that was connected to a serious commitment from the government, from the top down, to this idea of facing, confronting, and owning up to the Nazi past. So I decided to come back, and I've never regretted it. And but it was a process that I had followed very deeply and personally, even though I'm not a historian, I'm a philosopher, but followed partly because I wanted to figure out whether this was a place where I could live and bring up what were now 3 children instead of 1. And my answer was yes. I didn't do much serious intellectual work on the subject until June of 2015, when President Obama gave the eulogy for the 9 churchgoers who were massacred in Charleston. And watching that speech here in my Berlin apartment in tears, and seeing President Obama become the first national politician to propose that we take down Confederate symbols and to draw a connection between the violence of the past and the violence of the present, I thought, gosh, America is going through a Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, and this is something that I know something about, and perhaps I can contribute by writing something about it. I know that no 2 countries are alike and no 2 histories are alike, and I certainly didn't want to be in the position of lecturing America from afar. So I decided, I had a sabbatical coming to me, and I decided to spend the better part of a year in Mississippi, not because I believe that racism is only a problem in the South. Maybe a little further along, I'll tell you a story, an epiphany I had on the New Jersey Turnpike. Because I look at the Deep South as a magnifying glass for the rest of the country. Everything is simply much more explicit, both for better and for worse. And one certainly can't say, as one does in many parts of the country, oh, Americans don't think about history, they're always thinking about the future. Mississippians think about history all the time. They often get it wrong, but they're obsessed with it. And I spent time there as a scholar at what was then the Institute for Racial Reconciliation, which doesn't exist in the form that it did when I was there in 2016 and 2017, watching activists, scholars who were working on racial reconciliation, on coming up with a truer picture of our national past. And, following people around doing research. I interviewed a lot of people, which is, of course, an unusual thing to do for a philosopher. But I wanted not only to have my own voice in the book, actually, not too many philosophers write in the first person either, but that was important to me because I have this really quite unusual biographical perspective. I was born in the segregated South. My mother was deeply engaged in the fight to desegregate the public school system. So that was the atmosphere that I grew up in. So it's formed a big part of my consciousness. But at the same time, I have wound up spending most of my adult life as a Jewish woman in Berlin of all places. And it seemed to me this double perspective was important, but I also wanted to get other voices. So I interviewed people from, civil rights icons like James Meredith or Brian Stevenson, the National Lynching Memorial, but also ordinary people, some people who were very definitely on the other side, probably at least two who were members of the Klan. And I interviewed an awful lot of people in Germany as well. So the book is a patchwork, if you like, or a puzzle of people on both sides of these questions, where what interested me were always extremely personal questions. How does a man who is a friend of mine, actually, whose father was probably the biggest war profiteer and a personal friend of Hermann Goering's, how does he come to devote his inheritance and a significant part of his life to, making clear the crimes of the Wehrmacht and the Nazis? Why does one person do that and someone else doesn't? Or why does a man in Holly Springs, Mississippi, who's living in a beautiful old house that was made on, slave-earned, it was built on slave-earned money, cotton. Why does he decide that it's going to be a major issue in his life to reconstruct not just the beautiful antebellum house, but also the slave cabins, and to tell the story of that part of Mississippi, as well as the ways in which the Choctaws were kicked off the land that the house is now on? So all of those things were tremendously, tremendously important to me. One of the most important facts that I realized in my research was the following, and it shocks non-German audiences, and it even took me decades to really understand. When I first came to Berlin, many, many people were quite open in telling me that their parents were Nazis or their teachers were Nazis, and that they had, therefore extremely troubled and very distant relations to their families. But what they never told me was that their parents thought they were the worst victims of the war. And I have since, from reading things that were written just after the war and talking to people, I've realized that that's true. I've asked people, is that a matter of shame? Were you just simply too ashamed to talk about it? And they said, well, maybe, but mostly it was just so obvious. We lost the war. Our territory was dismembered. We lost about a third of our territory. We lost 7 million people. Our men were in POW camps and wounded, if they were alive at all. Our cities were burned, to ashes. Our children were hungry. And on top of it all, the damn Yankees wanted to blame us for starting the war. And of course, I hope that's ringing a bell in somebody's head besides mine, because the truth of the matter is that the first 4 decades of post-war West Germans thought of themselves as victims, not as perpetrators. And I've come to think that that's a very natural standpoint to take. We would all like to see our people as heroes. If we can't see them as heroes, we say, well, they would have been heroes if only they could, but history turned them into victims. What the Germans did, not particularly willingly in the beginning, most of them, was to make a further move and to say, yes, we did suffer a lot during the war and, after the war, but other people suffered worse and it was our fault. That is not something that any other nation has done. And again, while particularly in the West, the East has a very different story, which we can go into if you'd like in a little bit. It's a natural move, and it is something that should give Americans hope, I believe, because people get quite discouraged by seeing the kind of pushback that you get to, renaming streets or renaming military bases after traitors to the United States. I mean, to take one obvious case at the moment, but there are many, many others. There's a lot of resistance to that. And once we realize, well, you know what, there was resistance even, to the Nazis acknowledging that they had committed crimes, and it took time and it took work and it took, real persistence for those acknowledgments to start coming, and to realize that as painful as it was to rewrite their historical picture of themselves, it turned out better. It's a better and happier and saner place to live. So maybe I'll just stop there as far as an introduction goes and take questions from anybody who would like to ask them.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So much to cover, right, on comparisons and all of this. And one of the things that really struck me was about, you talked about the top-down approach, right? But then there's also all of these individuals doing things, right? And so maybe you could comment on what you feel might be most important, or do they work together? I don't want to, let you discuss that. But also we had a question going off of that. I also wonder about the current situation, right? And what happened this year. Maybe you could comment on that. And one of the questions, so to even add on to that, is from a dear friend of ours from the center, based on all of your studies and firsthand research, what is the first realistic step that America could take right now to start the process of working off the past? So I know I've given you a lot, so.
Okay. So look, I think those steps have been taken. At the very latest this summer, under the impact of Black Lives Matter, I am thrilled, frankly, which is not to say that I see no problems, but I am thrilled when after Black Lives Matter, over 70% of Americans say we have a problem with systemic racism, which means it's a problem that goes way beyond individual people being personally prejudiced or feeling hatred or resentment or whatever. We have a long history that has to be looked at, and people are already doing it. So let me then go back to your first question, and you may have to remind me what the second was. But the last and the first tie together. So top down is what happened in East Germany. For the record, I often have to say this because people, if you say anything good about a socialist country, like it has good healthcare or they did a better job in dealing with the Nazis, you get accused of being a Stalinist. For the record, I'm not. I'm not even a Marxist. I am a social democrat. What people often don't know is that Nazi ideology was absolutely not reducible to anti-Semitism. It was an important part of ideology, but it was an important part of a racist ideology. They also killed 14 million Slavs, which often tend to get forgotten in Western discussions of the Holocaust. They killed 14 million Slavs. And, if Rommel had not been pushed back by the Brits, they had maps describing what they were going to do to Africa. So I would much prefer to see racism as one piece of Nazi ideology. Yeah, anti-Semitism is different from some kinds of racism, but I don't find the differences to be all that crucial. Historians can argue about that, but morally, I don't see important differences between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. But the other pillar of Nazi ideology was anti-communism. They did first come to for the communists, as it says in that famous quote of Pastor Neiman. And the quote is often taken as, a reminder, if anybody's civil rights are threatened, everybody's civil rights will eventually be threatened. And that's true. But we also need to take it historically. First, they did come for the communists, and then they did come for the Social Democrats, and then they did come, for the Jews. And so what that meant is that the leadership of East Germany were all people who had either spent the war in a concentration camp or in exile. And that meant they were really committed anti-fascists. They were not simply putting it on. They thought the Nazis were criminals, and so that when they came to power at the end of the war, they were quite serious about getting old Nazis out of government offices, which did not happen in West Germany, putting people on trial far more than elsewhere, rewriting the history lesson plans. A lot of West Germans will tell you that in their school history stopped in 1933. That wasn't true in East Germany. And all children, they rebuilt Buchenwald as a memorial, and all children visited, some point during their school years, visited Buchenwald. So you had a quite serious top-down attempt, but of course, to some degree, it was the same population. I interviewed very many people because I was curious about the question, well, was it just top-down? How much of an effect did it actually have on people? And I particularly interviewed people who were members of the opposition in East Germany. All of whom told me, I could criticize just about everything in East Germany, but not the anti-fascism. That was genuine. So the majority of people say that. However, so what you can say that things that come from the government, things that you get in school, unless it's always done brilliantly, and after a couple of generations, it may not be done brilliantly, are always going to be less deep than things that you have to work out against the authority of the state. And in West Germany, that's exactly what happened. People really the government did not want to talk about Nazi crimes. They did pay reparations to the state of Israel, but there was a silent bargain that if they paid reparations, they could keep all the old Nazis in office that they wanted, and they wouldn't actually have to discuss what had happened. And you had, you had a bit of a silent period. The country was in ruins. It did need to be built up, but it was groups of people, partly the next generation, but also partly older people, insisting that the silence be broken and that people begin to discuss and to make memorials and so on and so on. My ideal would be a situation in which you had good leadership and grassroots activism. That's always the best combination. And of course, that's what I saw when President Obama began to call for a reckoning with Confederate symbolism. Leadership isn't enough. It needs also, that's just democracy. Democracy needs activism. What we've had in the past 4 years is, in a certain sense, it's not only been a lack of good leadership, it's just been a revelation of just how deep the racism and violence in our history goes, and how determined certain people are to hang on to it. But I'm hopeful that combination of things, that has brought to white people's consciousness things that really were not clear before. I'm hopeful that we may be turning a corner and that we may see some leadership combined with continued activism. Somebody asked what would be the first step. The first steps have been taken. What I would love to see, whether it will happen, I don't know. I would love to see every single monument that's being discussed, or torn down or at issue. I would love to see community-based discussions all over the country. as I've written, the whole debate, is it heritage or is it hate, seems to me completely misconstrued. It's not about heritage. We don't memorialize every piece of our history. We just don't. We pick and choose the people who represent values that we want our communities to share. And, and that has also nothing to do with hate in people's hearts. And of course, learning the history of the Confederate monuments, I certainly didn't know until 2015 that most of the monuments were put up when they were put up. I, bought the story that it was just a few people trying to remember their fathers or brothers or whatever, rather than to call for a new, redoubling of white supremacy. At two different periods. One is the beginning of the 20th century, and also one was in reaction to the civil rights movement. So I didn't know that. And I think a community-based discussion of each monument would, first of all, teach people some history of their communities that they don't know, but also allow each community to talk about what values they want represented in the 21st century, what they want replaced, whether a statue can be contextualized, whether you want to put something next to it, whether you think it should be taken down altogether and replaced with something else. I know this is happening on some college campuses. And of course, college campuses at their best really are communities in which one can do that sort of thing. But I believe it could be done elsewhere. Now, was there another question that I forgot?
I think you covered. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think you've covered that. And if it's okay, I want to move on and connect two other questions that we've gotten from very good friends of the center also. One comes from a student, and that question is, do you think using the Holocaust as a historical reference point is important and helpful when navigating current human rights crises? The other question says, can you elaborate on what you've written in your book, that Germans should talk about the singularity of the Holocaust, Jews should talk about its universality, and how can this be practically implemented? And I think that connection, right, of how do we think about the Holocaust, talk about it. I think you've got the gist on mute because it might be hard to hear, but I can elaborate if you need more. Sorry, thank you.
You got a loud dog. He wants to go outside, or so look, you're right, those questions are very connected. I think the Holocaust can only be useful if we take it as a universal possibility. And I'm not the only one to say that the Holocaust has been used in two ways. It can be used as this should never happen again, and this should never happen again to us. And, the second is a real problem to me. If there is any reason at all to remember the Holocaust and to have Holocaust teaching, I mean, obviously, for someone who has lost, even distant family in the Holocaust, remembering, is a private act of, honoring someone's suffering. But there's no reason for public commemoration and public study of the Holocaust unless it's to prevent other things from happening that's similar. What I worry sometimes, I mean, I'm sure this isn't the case, this is what you do for a living, several of you, so that I'm sure that what you're doing is serious scholarship, but it is so easy to meet people who say things like, well, of course the Holocaust was terrible because it was putting people in ovens for no reason. I mean, that's true, it's not a lie, but it is reducing an extraordinarily complex process of racism and dehumanization to this final action that people think they can see, they can visualize it very clearly. And I think what that has done in many cases is to say, oh, well, we have a picture of what evil is. It's that, it looks like that. And as long as you don't do that, in fact, I can remember, what's his name, Louis Farrakhan once making a statement years ago saying, I'm not anti-Semitic, I don't want people to be put into ovens. This is not okay. But forget Farrakhan even for a second, just in general, I think it's allowed many, many people all over the world, and by no means only Americans, to say, okay, we know what evil is, and everything that isn't that doesn't look like that may be slightly less horrible than that, is kind of okay. Or, it's too bad, but it's kind of okay. And so that's where I think working with the Holocaust gets really, really tricky. I know that gas chambers are things that you can get people's attention with, especially if they're young or not terribly educated. But I really worry that by focusing on the endpoint of the Holocaust, we're actually skewing our picture of what evil is and what we can do about it in the future. So the quote that I take from the Bulgarian-French critic Tzvetan Todorov, Germans should talk about the singularity and Jews should talk about the universality, is I think it's a deep and lovely point. Germans have had an interesting and difficult problem with this book. It's translated into German. For Germans, most of them anyway, making any comparison with the Holocaust is a way of excusing it, because the Nazis certainly did. I mean, Hitler wrote, well, look at what the Americans did to Native Americans when they wanted the land. So, why can't I just go, roll into the East when I want Lebensraum? He said, and he was right, of course. You make historical precedent and something becomes possible that seemed impossible, or at least, deeply wrong itself. Or comparing the murder of the Jews to the murder of the Armenians and saying, who remembers the Armenians? So because Nazis talked that way, Germans are extremely hesitant to make any comparisons whatsoever. And to some degree, I get it, and I think that's right, because for a German to say the Holocaust is unique is a way of taking responsibility rather than avoiding it. But I fear that for a Jew to say the Holocaust was unique can sometimes turn into saying, the suffering of my people counts more than anybody else's suffering. And, while that has been one tradition in Jewish thought, there is another tradition, a universalist tradition, the one that I was raised on, which says, we were strangers in the land of Egypt and we were slaves in the land of Egypt, and therefore we have a responsibility to welcome the stranger and to stand with the slave. And so if using the Holocaust is used in that way, then I think it can be very helpful. But I do think people need to be careful, because it's, of course, much easier to simplify the Holocaust and say, well, it was just about anti-Semitism. So if people are nice to Jews, or nice to anybody claiming that they represent Jews, although I won't get into that, can of worms, if it's used that way, then I think it can be quite destructive. I see a question here. Have the Germans dealt with World War II memory better than the U.S. has dealt with the memory of the Civil War? I've got to say there's no comparison whatsoever. Not even close. That's why I wrote this book. The interesting thing is that the title of the book was very provocative when I was walking around in 2016 and 2017 doing my research in the States, where people were absolutely shocked by the idea that there might be some comparison or something that we could learn from the Germans. When I did my book tour last fall a year ago, no one was bothered by the title at all. And I take it that after Charlottesville and a whole host of other events that most Americans could see, there was very much the sense that, yes, we need to deal with our past. But to the questioner, just no comparison whatsoever.
I wanted to ask a real quick question about memorials, right? Because you're talking a lot about memorials, and in the book, you discuss monuments of horror, like concentration camp and death camp memorials, right? And go into detail about that. And you say one shouldn't go to many, and certainly not often. Can you elaborate a little bit on this? And couldn't the argument be made that if people went to more sites such as this, or that if more historic sites in the USA were crafted in a sense of horror of slavery, it would bring the issue into a much sharper focus for more people?
Look, I think it is a truth, it's just a simple truth of human psychology, that we get used to things. We get used to all kinds of things, no matter what they are, no matter whether we told ourselves not to normalize them. We're only capable of a certain amount of outrage. We can't, keep being outraged all the time. And so I think if, and there are people who go to see every concentration camp or every site of horror, and I think that actually becomes quite problematic. I don't think you can maintain a sense of outrage if that's what you do. If, on the other hand, you do what Brian Stevenson has done, and I know it's a ways from New Jersey, but I have to urge everyone to visit the National Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. It is worth a trip all the way down to Montgomery, because while there are plenty of pictures on the web, the pictures don't do it justice. I did not describe it very thoroughly in my book, because when I visited the Equal Justice Initiative and interviewed Brian Stevenson, the monument was still under construction. So when the book went to press, I hadn't actually seen it. I saw it afterwards, and I was awestruck by it. I have never in my life seen a monument that both succeeds in conveying terror and horror, but doesn't wallow in it. Somehow most people apparently cry at the memorial. I certainly did, and I don't cry all that often, but you go out with a sense of hope, and it's just brilliant. Now, doing things like that, and there's also, it's not anything like on the scale or with the seriousness of thought, but there's a good, the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana is also it's reconstructed a plantation from the perspective of the slaves. So the emphasis is very much not on, pretending that you're Scarlett O'Hara, but pretending that, or seeing the perspective of someone who was working, cutting and boiling sugarcane and, serving the masters. And that's a powerful museum, which I would also recommend. I certainly think we need more of those things in the United States. Absolutely. All of them should go take lessons from the National Lynching Memorial, just because it's such a hard thing to do right. And I know that Brian Stevenson told me he obviously went to Germany. He took a lot from Germany, but he also went to South Africa and Rwanda and looked at memorials there. There was an incredible amount of thought that went into building that. And I think we could very definitely use those. I just, the only reason for saying that is I think that if all you do with your life, or even with half your life, is focus on acts of horror it's very hard not to become inured to them.
So I'm going to share another question that we've gotten, thinking about America's dark past. The question reads, do you think America's issues and inability to deal with slavery has to do with the fact that slavery was critical to the foundation development of the country? So this idea that decrying slavery decries the American exceptionalism myth.
It's a good question. And I think that's part of the answer, but it's not the whole one. First of all, whoever asked the question knows more than I did 5 years ago about the centrality of slavery to building the American economy. I think most people still think, well, you know, I didn't come from Mississippi or Alabama, and, you know, yes, we know that a lot of wealth was built up in cotton plantations, but we don't know how central cotton was to the building of the entire American economy. And for anyone who hasn't read it, I recommend a very good book by Edward Baptist, the historian, The Half Has Never Been Told, which talks about exactly how cotton was produced through torture and just how central it was to the American economy. So, you know, I mean, I think our Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung really did begin 5 years ago with the Charleston massacre and the beginning of discussions about that and taking down the flag and so on. But what happened were not just these symbolic gestures. People began to open what I think is a 100-year-old hole in our history. Most white people, and I was very much among them before I began to do this research, think, well, yes, of course, you can't ignore the Civil War. But we fought a Civil War and the slaves were freed. And then with the awful euphemism Jim Crow, which I am simply urging people to get rid of as often as possible, because what Jim Crow suggests is, okay, there were racist stereotypes and there were racial prejudices, but nothing like what Brian Stevenson calls an age of racial terror or an age of apartheid. And Jim Crow, you know, which everybody just uses, not everybody, some people don't, is a way of covering up that empty space between the end of the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement, the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So there's 100 years of history which most white Americans know almost nothing about. I mean, I've met professors of American history who didn't know much about Reconstruction, professors of 19th century American history who didn't know much about Reconstruction. And I think it's a combination of our not knowing how central slavery was to the American economy, but also, and crucially, how long various forms of neo-slavery persisted that, you know, has delayed or made it difficult for us to come to terms with that. Another book that I have to recommend that I learned a lot from is called Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman, which I strongly urge people to read. It's only one of the ways in which neo-slavery persisted, but it was a very important one. So, yeah.
So another question that just came through, making this comparison again between Holocaust and slavery, sort of. It reads, you say of the anti-Semitism of some in your book that it's not their fault they swallowed poison where there was nothing else to drink. And the question reads, this seems an invitation to empathy. So how is this different to or similar to dealing with lost cause believers?
Yeah. So, yeah, I was talking about were Syrian refugees in that passage, in that chapter, who were brought up with absolutely no knowledge of Jews, Jewish history. There was what they got in their school books and what they got from the government was, a horrible anti-Semitic, very one-sided picture. And what was interesting, I was meeting them because there was a Druze. Druze are neither Palestinian nor Israeli, but sort of halfway in between. That's not quite. No, they're Israeli citizens, but they're not Jewish, but they're not entirely Arabs either. But this was a man who was running seminars to answer the question. It is a big question, with now 1/5 of the German population having at least one non-German parent. The question is, if we take, confrontation with the Nazi past to be part of our education and part of our identity, what do we do about all of these immigrants for whom it was not a historical part of their lives, and in particular, some from Arab countries who really were sitting with horrible anti-Semitic narratives in their lives. And what was very interesting was to see that this kind of discussion could work. I saw it work. I saw it possible for most of these people are pretty young, but not all of them, to learn something about Jewish history, meet a live Jew, as in me, ask questions, learn about the Holocaust. It can happen, and I'm sure that it can happen with some people who believe in the lost cause as well. I don't think it's only a factor of age. You do see people at older ages who are open to learning. It's true that people are less open to learning the older they get and the longer that they've held on successfully to a particular ideology, but it can happen. I am a big fan of these, small community-based groups of dialogue, which are happening in many parts of the country, of the US. They're often highlighted as discussion groups between descendants of enslaved people and descendants of slave owners, but they're also happening among people who don't actually have that heritage, but are just concerned. Will we change everyone? No, we won't. But can we change some if we try to understand what's important to them about these myths? But we have to break them down. I mean, I'm certainly not saying that on the contrary, anybody who says, I'm just honoring my great-grandfather who fought to defend his homeland, has got to be told, I get that he was brave. I get that he maybe fell or, was wounded and suffered, but the cause he was fighting for was wrong, and this is what it is. It's quite interesting. Some of these people who will defend the Confederacy have, of course, they're absolutely bent on denying that slavery was central to the cause of the Civil War. And this has a long tradition in teaching of American history, not only in the South. It's a fun fact that I found out, I put in the book somewhere. If you become a United States citizen, if you're an immigrant taking your test, you have to take a test in American history, and it's a multiple choice test. And the only question that allows for more than one right answer is, what was the cause of the Civil War? So you could either check slavery, you can check economic reasons, or you can check states' rights, leaving open, of course, the question, states' rights to do what, But, so this is U.S. policy is ambiguous on the question of, or not prepared to take a stand on the question of what caused the Civil War. And, until we change that and acknowledge that there are matters of fact, I mean, all you have to do is read the Articles of Secession. Each state that seceded from the Union wrote, had a state legislature that drew up articles and said, this is why we're seceding. And they all put, protecting slavery, if not the very first thing. I haven't read all of them. I certainly know the Mississippi Declaration practically by heart, but all of them, talk about slavery as a reason for going to war. So, first of all, we have to establish some facts. Again, I don't think we'll convince everyone. I mean, there are still old Nazis, or old Nazis. Most of them are dead in Germany, but there, every once in a while we get right-wing people who want to revive various elements of Nazi policy. As I said at the end of the introduction, little suspecting that everybody would be talking about vaccines a year after it came out, it's not an inoculation. It's not this process of working off the past is not a one-shot deal. Now that we are all talking about inoculations, I've been thinking, well, maybe it's like a flu shot that you have to renew every once in a while or something. But we won't get everybody, but we will make significant progress.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to say the activism is great, and maybe you could comment a little bit, because it has been part of your life for a very long time, as I understand. And also this idea of hope, very, very important, right, for the future. But we've had several questions. So activism, hope, and then we've had many questions about reparations, right, and the feasibility of symbolic or monetary reparations in the U.S., and what that might potentially look like, or models that would work well for the U.S. Moving forward.
Let me start with the last question first. I think that reparations to African Americans would be just, for the two reasons that I pointed out a little while ago. Number one, because so much of the U.S. economy was built on the foundation of slavery, and because forms of modified slavery persisted so long into the future. I mean, the fact that most African Americans couldn't get Social Security for a very long time, the fact that Black GIs couldn't get mortgage loans coming back from service, all of those things, whether or not you owned slaves or, came to this country, your ancestors came to this country after slavery was abolished, are, like most white people in this country who came in the waves of immigration after the end of the Civil War, none of those things are relevant. Okay, all of those things are parts of white privilege, because your grandparents probably got Social Security, and your father probably got a house on the GI Bill. So in a sense of perfect justice, I think there is absolutely a claim on the country for reparations. The question is how it should happen. And first of all, I'd like to say I'm not an economist. There are a number of good economists working on possible proposals, and so I would refer questioners to them. But I'm also struck by the fact that many of the proposals are not about checks. They're about giving, a certain set of what in the United States are called benefits to African Americans. I have to point out that what Americans consider to be benefits, Europeans consider to be rights, and not just Scandinavians, but Germany is the fourth largest economy in the world, and you would your mouth would presumably drop open if I listed all of the rights that a German worker has. You know, everything from 6 weeks of paid vacation to basically unlimited sick leave if a doctor says that you're sick, to, you know, it just, and those parental leave of 16 months if both parents share it, and, you know, and those are things that are considered to be as sacred as, you know, your right to freedom of speech. They just are. Education, of course, is free. And you know, when I explain to Europeans what things are like, say particularly what sick leave in a pandemic is, you know, what the absence of sick leave in a pandemic does, particularly for those workers who are making sure that we get our groceries on the table and our packages delivered if we're lucky enough to be able to work in home offices. They're shocked. They don't just say it's too bad. They think it's barbaric. It really, really shocks them in the way that you would be shocked if somebody said, oh, well, they're not allowed to travel beyond the border of their country. You would call that barbaric. They feel that this is barbaric. So a lot of the proposals that have been made about reparations involve, you know, giving free education to descendants of enslaved people, or, you know, certain kinds of things that I strongly believe the entire country should have. And I think the level of rage in the United States would be vastly affected if people felt they weren't terrified to get sick because they would have to choose between, you know, staying home and losing their lease because they couldn't pay rent, you know. So I think that all of those things would be good for everybody. What I asked in my discussion of reparations was, supposing that the U.S. got to the point where Germany got to, in, you know, making sure that a whole palette of rights were considered self-evident for everyone, would African Americans be owed more? And the answer is yes. Okay, I think the answer is unequivocally less. But the question of strategically what ought to come first, I'm really not sure about that. And I'm beginning to think that just strategically it would be more important for everyone in the country to have a set of rights that led to a saner way of life before African Americans are. I mean, obviously, if it's a question of putting in line, I would put African Americans first, but I would also extend those rights to everyone. And then, you know, if I were czar, I would give additional wealth to African Americans to make up for the wealth that their families didn't have a chance to build up over generations. I mean, we all know that most people's major source of wealth is in their home. And so if you didn't have the opportunity to buy a home, or if your parents didn't or grandparents didn't, you're in a very different situation than if they did. So I am, this is my answer. It's a complicated answer, partly because I'm still thinking about this, and also thinking about it, you know, very much in the light of our current political situation and what actually might conceivably be a workable way forward. What, there was another, oh, you wanted me to talk about hope? Was there something besides hope?
Yeah, so maybe this will tie into our next question, but if I just wanted to, you know, let everyone know your activism, right? This has been sort of part of what you have, you know, grown up with. So I wanted you to just comment on that quickly, if possible.
Oh gosh, I honestly don't feel I've been as activist as I could have been, you know, and I sometimes feel like I should do more. I was actually playing with the idea since, as you mentioned, an awful lot of the national future depends on Georgia. I was playing with the idea of, forget the pandemic, I'll just get on a plane and go down and knock on doors, which is something that I did in the first Obama campaign. There I did an awful lot of getting out the vote and, that sort of foot soldiering. I was wavering about that because I'm old enough to count as being in a risk group. And the Georgia Democratic Party has actually issued a "don't come, there's a pandemic, we don't need you, send money." But so I've sent Stacey Abrams' outfit some money. But I get it. I mean, I don't, as much as I would actually like to do that, I also have to add, if I had left Georgia, I don't know, 10 years ago, I would still have a very active network of people there, and I might be able to do some more good than a normal foot soldier. But I left Georgia as a teenager, and it's not like I have a wealth of connections where I could say, here, use me, put me there. So I've decided to do what I suppose is most useful. I don't know where to start. I did grow up in a civil rights. Well, not my father, but my mother was very active and got threats from the Klan, even, which my parents didn't tell me when I was a child, of course, but it was there. And I have been to my share of demonstrations and even gotten arrested at a demonstration at Richard Nixon's inaugural. I've come to feel that as an intellectual, perhaps with the exception of, I did a lot of talking during the Obama campaign too. I felt that writing and speaking, more than other ways, other kinds of activism, are the ways that I can be most useful. Sometimes it feels a bit, you're just doing more of the same, but because writing and talking is after all what I do. But writing and talking to particular groups and trying to reach out to different kinds of people in different circumstances is something that I've done, in a variety of causes when I can. I mean, from the Bosnian War, I suppose I got quite involved in that. A number of things. And I guess my feeling is, and there were certainly times when I was raising young children, although I was so tired raising young children during the war in Bosnia that someone had to remind me many years later that he was inspired by my organization of some activities calling attention to the war in Bosnia. I had actually forgotten about them because I did do that, but I also had 3 little children at the same time. So, and look, there are times in everybody's life when activism has to take a back seat, and that's clear. I do think, however, that everyone, I guess the peace process in Israel is another thing that I've been different times of my life involved in. I think everyone will feel better about our sense of helplessness often. We read the news, we look at events, and we feel depressed or angry, but mostly we feel helpless. And I think even a little bit of activism on some cause, take some local, it can be some very local thing, is not only making some contribution to making the world slightly better, it also makes you feel better. It really does. So I would urge everybody to try that. Lord knows we are really going to need it in the next 4 years, because whatever happens on January 20th, what we have You know, I should say I've gotten emails from two different friends, one in Senegal and one in Egypt, who are commenting on the election and saying, you know, sadly, we know this, you know, we thought the US was different, but this kind of, you know, corruption, this kind of attempts at taking, undermining democracy, this is developing country stuff. You know, we wanted to think the US was different, but it's not. And my friend from Senegal he said, the whole world is watching. Tell me what's going to happen. The whole world is watching in terror. Well, the whole world really is watching, or a great deal of it. And an awful lot depends on what happens in the United States. I've had friends ask me, you know, how they can get European citizenship, and you know, before the election, if worse came to worse. And I've had to say, look, you know, life is pleasanter in Europe. There's no question about that. But it won't matter, because actually what happens in the United States affects the entire world. And we can see the way that, you know, even if the US has lost some of its, function as an idealistic model since the war in Vietnam, certainly since the war in Iraq. We got a little of it back under President Obama. Even though it's lost its sparkle in many places, there's still the idea that it's a leading country, and it has been used in the last 4 years to say, well, President of the United States can do it, why can't I? So, you know, making sure that democracy stays alive in the United States is not only important for the United States, it really is important for the rest of the world, and there's going to be a lot to do.
So, sadly, we are a few minutes over time, and I say sadly because I have a slew of questions waiting, and have also been getting texts from people saying how wonderful this hour and 15 minutes has been, and how so many people want to have dinner with you because you are just fantastic. So let me first apologize to those of you whose questions we didn't have an opportunity to ask. Truly, I'm sorry, because I would love to keep going for another hour. That being said, let me thank you on behalf of all of us on the panel, everyone who is attending, for your time and your wisdom and your spark of hope there at the end. Feels like a nice way to leave the conversation. So thank you.
Can I ask you, could you send me, I like to read the questions, even if I don't get a chance to answer them. They usually disappear when the thing goes off, but if you could send them to me, I'd appreciate it.
I see other panelists shaking their heads yes. That's slightly beyond my technical ability, but it looks like everybody else whose face you see on the screen is currently working on it. So the answer to that is yes, I think so.
Okay.
And thank you, wishing you a happy Thanksgiving, a safe couple of months. And truly, thank you for your time. And everyone who's here, same wishes to you. Happy Thanksgiving, stay safe, stay healthy.
And who knows, you know, maybe I'm actually supposed to, not this coming year, but the next year, I'm supposed to be giving some talks at Rutgers. So who knows, maybe, you know,
yes,
maybe we can have time.
Yes, on behalf of, 50 people who are here, like, we'd all love to have lunch with you. So you'll let us know when you're in New Jersey and we'll figure out how to make it work.
Okay. Will do. All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.